Okay, so welcome to the next episode of our non-webbing project podcast series. The non-webbing project is a project designed to empower communities, working alongside with the researchers to be able to address an issue that affects them. And under that project, we've been looking at young people's mental health and well-being and trying to develop resources, interventions to help to address that. We have had series of podcasts in the past looking at the learning from young people, the learning from community members, and also the learning from researchers. In this particular episode, we'll be looking at the context of how to reach community, because this project involved working with people from the minoritized ethnic communities, and the focus has been around understanding them and working alongside with them to develop interventions. So for this particular podcast, we really want to look at that concept and try to share our learning around that. And here with me, Rose and Abigail, they have been part of this project and will be just sharing our learning and talking about what we have learned so far within this context. Yeah, Rose, what do you think?
So I'm engaging with this topic from two perspectives. One is from my own professional background as having done some research and some ongoing research too, but also in my capacity as a parent and part of the community for this particular research project. So we'll be having discussions about the concept of hard to reach from those two perspectives. And I'll just give Abigail an opportunity to introduce herself, and then we'll get straight into it.
Yeah, my name's Abigail. I'll be reflecting upon my participation in this project as a researcher, but also thinking about how engaging with local community, young people, community leaders, and their parents, as someone who's from a psychological background where we often do research with this group, but perhaps not so successfully. I'll be thinking about the learning I might take back to my professional context and how we can perhaps do research a little bit better.
So the whole idea or the whole concept of hard to reach has been a bugbear, I think not only of mine, but of us collectively, because this is a term that's often used to describe communities that I think for the most part, little effort will have been made to understand, explore the reasons why engagement might be problematic. And I think one of the difficulties is the way that questions are asked, as in not even questions to the community as part of the research project, but questions in terms of trying to understand why a community might be perceived as hard to reach. So rather than saying, why are these people difficult or hard to reach, I think the question should be, what is it about our processes and the way that we approach groups that makes it difficult for us to have meaningful engagement? Because I think asking the question in that way changes the focus of progress, and it helps researchers particularly to do a bit more introspection, thinking about how can we enhance processes, ways of approaching that might make the outcome successful, not just for researchers, but also for the communities that people are trying to engage with. So our purpose of coming together to collectively, individually and collectively reflect on this problematic statement, I think will give grounds, hopefully, for other people who want to engage with communities to think about, so that they can position themselves in the best way to be able to get the best results. So we're trying to dispel this whole myth of hard to reach and thinking about, rather than defining groups as hard to reach, can we try to think instead of what are the barriers to engagement? What makes it difficult for communities to engage, or what makes the approach or the manner in which communities are approached problematic to outcomes? So I think that's one of the things that we'll be talking about, and we're going to use the Norm Wellbeing Project, which Franklin has just described, as an example of actually how we've come to understand how to approach communities and how to do that successfully, and be able to shift the perspective of this concept of hard to reach and showcase ways in which it actually has been relatively straightforward, simple to reach out to communities who would otherwise be described as hard to reach.
I think when I was hearing you speak just then, I was thinking about that concept of a legacy of mistrust. So obviously, being a psychologist by background, I also think about how medical services and engagements with medicines
Yeah.
has shaped how the Black community engages or doesn't engage with the concept of mental health. And I think one of the things that stuck out to me, one of the parents said was that, oh, I feel safe here to talk about this. And I think when we explored that further, one of the things that came up a lot from the parents was, I feel it's okay to talk about the barriers to this discussion, or perhaps some of the issues or challenges that I'm facing with my children, because there's no sense that there's going to be a negative repercussion. There's not going to be a judgment placed upon the quality of my parenting or the ways in which my culture influences my child rearing that's going to be frowned upon or viewed as less than, inferior, negative, or even, I guess, backwards or less civilized than others. And I think when I look at how the young people and their parents were able to come together in that co-production workshop, a foundation of that was we had spoken with the parents over time, we had spoken with the young people over time, and both groups said, I feel okay to share. And I wonder whether for other, I guess, academics, researchers, people who are trying to connect with people from minoritized ethnic groups, whether there's something about positioning yourself as equal, not as superior or academic in knowledge, but positioning yourself as someone who might also learn from their experience to incorporate into your own practice, rather than going to just see them as people who are going to populate a data chart. I think that was really a standout point for me, that legacy of mistrust, and how dispelling that meant that very quickly people wanted to share. We didn't have to draw blood from a stone to get parents talking. After the first few questions, it was kind of like, well, let's sit back and listen to them talk, because they were generating a lot of information that I think was valuable to the project.
I've got quite a few thoughts about some of the things that you've raised, but I'm going to let Franklin have a go.
I'm just gonna ask because I've been thinking about this, just taking us back a little bit about the whole concept. Where did it even start from? When you look at a particular community, you say they are hard to reach. I was just I've been thinking around that. I mean, what brought the label? What led to that conclusion? And and all of that. Because I mean, from the project we have done so far and from our previous work, we have we have seen that this group, they are not hard to reach. We have done successful projects. We had easy access right from the beginning, to the end. There was no barrier in between. And that really made me to think, okay, what would such a group be labeled, how to reach? Is it really how to reach? Or the other, I'm taking on that concept again about, is it hard to reach or how to reach? Right? So I think it just flipping it a little bit. Is it that they're hard to reach, or people don't really know how to reach them? And I think often, people tend to kind of move away from that how and just label them that, no, they're hard to reach. You can't really have access. We have tried and all of that. But in actual sense, the how is not there. So I think it's important, for us to pay attention, to that in terms of how. And if you don't know the how, you continue to label them hard to reach, but they're not really hard to reach, but just that you don't know how. And that's why this conversation, I think, is important to, bring, shape that a little bit and throw more light on that, just to guide people on how best to, to read this community.
Do you think part of that is also, I guess this is another question, which is the why, or to what end? So if someone's labeling a group as hard to reach, is part of the challenge that the purpose of them reaching them isn't mutually beneficial? So if I'm coming to a community and I'm like, hey, I want to help you, I have all this money, I have all this resource, how best to use it? Which group is going to say, whoa, no, thank you, I'd like to stay here, sans money in my difficulty and challenge? That's very rare. But I wonder if the exchange hasn't always appeared equitable. If you're approaching a group for research, but you are extractive, then obviously the group is going to position themselves as why are you asking these questions, and what for, and what's the benefit? And rather than labeling that questioning as paranoia and saying, well, they're hard to reach, they're paranoid about why I've come, perhaps the in the how to reach them is positioning yourself as someone who can offer support, offer engagement, or who wants to learn from them also. And then the why, being a positive reason, might encourage, I guess, more helpful and fruitful relationships moving forward.
I think also there's something to be said about people's understanding of what research looks like, because I think people's thoughts about what research should be, and sometimes those narrow understandings mean that the roles that people take up in research also become defined by what they think research should be. And I think I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, which was about power dynamics. And I think there's a lot of talk in research about being really mindful of the power imbalance, but I think more often than not, that just becomes a theoretical consideration. When it comes to practice, I think there's a lot of reluctance to actually shift the power dynamics in research interactions. But I think particularly with this project, what I found was actually really leaning sincerely and genuinely into community-led strategies, even though that means that as a researcher, that might, for you, feel quite destabilizing, feel quite like, well, I'm usually in control of a process and I don't quite know how to deal with a process that I'm not in control of. I don't really know which direction this is going to go. And I think our fixation sometimes with a particular type of outcome means that we are almost compelled to control that process so much so that if we're asked to reposition ourselves and that becomes too difficult, it's easier to just say, oh, well, that group doesn't engage, rather than maybe I need to step back and reconsider the approaches that I use. And using a different set of approaches might mean that I'm occupying a position that's uncomfortable for me, or one that I've not traditionally, as a researcher, put myself in that position, and I don't really know how to do it, picking up on what you're saying. So I think a lot of it has to do with just rethinking exactly what is research, what is the purpose for research, so in whose interest, to what end, with what benefit, and asking all those questions right from the beginning, I think helps to then situate researchers in a different capacity, and I think in a capacity that might enable people to find the benefit of engaging in that exchange. So I think a lot of it is just rethinking what research looks like, and how to then engage with communities.
And I think what you mentioned around the power balance is quite important, because that's why the ideas fund model is so important, and that's why we're encouraging some funders out there to embrace it, because this is a kind of model where the communities have been empowered. They have that ownership to do what is important to them, okay, and then bringing researchers on board, but sharing that, having that balance of power. Okay, so the power is not skewed. There's a balance. The community, they have got a say, and all of that, which really contributes, to the success of community-led, approach, which is, we are quite pleased that we have piloted this, and we have seen how successful it is, which we're encouraging other funders to look towards, in this direction, to see how they can reimagine things and rethink how they allocate funds, and what they think, like you said, what they think research is, who should do it, who should own it, and all of that, to bring, that balance, which I think is quite important.
So maybe just to consolidate that, we've talked about and touched on quite a number of different things, but we're hoping that this just provokes some thoughts and some conversations even within research teams about how to change, I suppose, perspectives about research, how to rethink some of the approaches to communities, and how to center communities as the leaders and the people who take the first step, I suppose, in research processes, and what balancing out power really actually means in practical terms, and shifting that just from a theoretical perspective. So hopefully it gives some food for thought to people who might be thinking about reaching out to communities who've embodied these labels in a misguided way, but thinking about how to then push forward and move on.